Good morning, everyone. My name is Pablo Oñate. I'm a professor of political science in the University of Valencia, and it's my great pleasure to be here today in order to deal with this relevant topic with such an excellent group of paper givers as those that we have here today. I think it's a privilege for this city to have them here and to have the chance to listen to their presentations and to discuss with them afterwards on this relevant topic, as we have seen in the last electoral processes in Spain, the radical right, and how is it growing or evolving in Europe and in Valencia. As you know, there are many ways of understanding or analyzing the radical right and the way it's evolving in different countries. We might see it from the individual point of view, what kind of characteristics have those who support this radical right, or we can perceive it as a protest vote, people feeling upset and people feeling not happy with those with the offer of parties that they have when they go to the poll station, people who could be convinced of their programs or be convinced about or have the same ideology or the proposals or the platforms, party platforms that these parties are throwing. Of course, we can see or analyze it from the point of view of the offer. What are these parties? Why it took so long to have these parties here in Spain when compared to other countries in Europe, or why they have not developed in other countries, as in Portugal. We can analyze their organization, how they organize, or we can analyze how they communicate, or what are their party platforms, programs, ideas, and so on. And of course, we can also analyze this topic from the point of view of the political opportunity structure, how the institutional setting in wide terms, how the institutional setting or the specific variables that are in a given country, such as immigration, unemployment rates, the electoral system, the decentralization process and situation in each country, how they influence the flourishing of the radical right. As I said, I think we have 4 wonderful experts here that are going to elaborate in different points of view on these relevant topics. To start with, we have Camille Kelbel, who is from the Université Libre de Bruxelles, and she's going to talk about the Front National, the winner of the realignment of the French party system. I think we can have like 20 minutes presentation and then maybe 10 minutes for question Q&As. Okay? So Camille, whenever you want. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, and please stop me if I go over my time as well. That's no problem at all. Thank you, and I wanted to start by thanking the organizers and the Nexe Foundation for putting together this very nice workshop. Maybe the first thing I wanted to say that in France, for more than 3 decades, the focus of political analysis has been on the left of the political spectrum. We've always looked at the specificity of the French left. But of course, we've underwent specific events in the recent years that have forced us to change this perspective. And here I've been asked to examine 3 different questions: the transformation of party competition in France with a focus on the right side of the spectrum, the emergence of new parties, and of course the results of the European elections. And to start, given the topicality of the issue, I thought I would start with the results of the European elections that took place last Sunday in France. And maybe a first peculiarity of EP elections, when we look at EP elections, is that the first thing people look at are not the results, they are the abstention and participation in EP elections. And so I'm going to do the same, and to tell you that this time, as you probably know, participation has been higher in most member states than it has been in the previous European elections. And France is actually a typical example of this. Participation has gone from a bit over 42% in 2014 to 50.12% this time around. And actually, this is the best participation rate that we've had in European Parliament elections since 1994. And interestingly, it's even higher than the participation rate we had in the last legislative elections in France, which is very rare. Yet I would say that this surge of participation should not be understood as a repoliticization of these elections. As you've probably heard, over the past months in France, we have witnessed an extraordinary rich, an extraordinary novel type of democratic life that has developed around what we call the yellow vest movement. I don't know if you've heard of it. I guess. And in fact, if you think about it, this did not really materialize in the elections. Because in fact, what happened is that 50% is a good participation rate for European elections, but it's still relatively low. It still means that 1 out of 2 registered voters did not go to the poll, and that's not even taking into account the unregistered voters. So if the event that happened in the street should have materialized in the polls, we should have had a bigger surge in participation, and this didn't really happen. So then still, what are the results of the European Parliament elections? Well, the extreme right, what's called the National Rally now, won 23.3%. And La République En Marche, so you can call it in English the Republic on the Move, but it doesn't really make sense, so I'll stick with the French name. La République En Marche received 22.4%. And I believe there are 3 things that could be said about these results. They are not particularly surprising, they are not new, but they're very specific to France. Let me explain why I say that. Well, first, they're not particularly surprising nor new, since there's been a marked evolution of the party system in France, and in a sense, this is just one more replica of what we've been given to see since 2015. And then they're quite specific to France. Why do I say that? Because people keep telling us that there is a Eurosceptic threat. Since the 2014 European elections, we've heard that the Eurosceptic might take over the European Parliament. And in fact, this didn't happen. There is just one country where this actually happened, and this is France. This is the only country where twice in a row, the Eurosceptic actually won the elections. They won in 2014, and they won in 2019. In fact, there is one other country where this also happened, but this is the UK, and so it's kind of a specific case, and I'm not going to compare here. In 2014, the National Front, so it changed the name from National Front to National Rally, but of course it's the same party. In 2014, it gathered almost 25% of the votes. And it won by a largest margin of victory than it did just right now, because the main opposition party, then the UMP, had a bit less than 21%. So in 2019, results are more tight, and the share of votes is lower for the National Rally. But what's really important is that it increased its scores in absolute value, and it gained around 500,000 voters. 500,000 more people voted for the National Rally in France in 2019 compared to 2014, because more people participate, so automatically this means they had more voters. So what can we say on these results? Well, I can put on the table 3 points of analysis. What's interesting is that the National Rally was able to maintain and even assert its position over a long period of 5 years. And during this period, all the rest of the political spectrum was totally recomposed. At the same time, if you look at on a shorter-term perspective, there's been no radical change since the presidential and legislative elections of 2017 in France. And in this sense, the European elections are just kind of a follow-up of what we've been seeing in the last 2 years in France. What I think is a bit different still about these European elections compared to the legislative elections is that now the focus is more clearly on the opposition between En Marche and the National Rally, and the 2 other blocs that were still there at the legislative and presidential elections are not there anymore. And also, a lot of observers have noticed that there's been a kind of pro versus anti-EU discourse, that the focus of the discourse has been on European issues during these European elections, which is also a very rare event. Usually we talk about different things. And in fact, it's precisely because it was these 2 parties that were in the race that this was possible. All other parties, of course, tried to avoid this dichotomy, but they didn't really manage to do that. So based on the results, it's clear that the conflict between the elite bloc and the popular bloc is confirmed, and it's now bigger than the left-right divide in this sense. And in this sense, I would say that we have, with this election, a more polarized political landscape. So of course, as we all know, EP elections are not so interesting by themselves, in themselves, but rather for what they tell us about parties and electoral competition more generally, and this is then what I'm going to look at now. So this workshop is about new radical right in Southern Europe, And I was asked to consider political realignments in France. What I would like to discuss today is in fact the relevance of this issue for France. And I will make two arguments. First, that it's too early to talk about a realignment. It seems likely to happen in the future, but what I'm going to show you is that it didn't happen yet. And second, if the National Rally has become the focal point of electoral competition, that's for sure, it's the focal point, but that doesn't mean that it's the winner of the realignment or the supposed realignment. Well, I thought that before asking whether there's been a realignment or not, there is kind of a need to conceptualize a bit. Political scientists, we like to do that, to conceptualize a bit what realignments in fact are, and what we mean by realignment in political science. Well, realignment take 20 to 30 years. And according to the literature, especially to the work of Pierre Martin, they are characterized by three different steps. You need a rupture election, a realignment phase, and a realignment elections. Here, we did have a rupture elections with the presidential elections of 2017, and further qualification, but then ultimately the victory of Emmanuel Macron over Marine Le Pen. What we still do not have is a realignment election, a stabilization election, if you'd like. So some people will tell me, yes, but now we have these European elections that confirm the results of the national election. Well, I think that European elections cannot qualify as realignment elections because they are what we call second-order elections. So by nature, they upset the party system. It's not really a surprise that they do. Let's take a step back and look at the evolution of the electoral results in a longer-term perspective. On the graph, you see the compiled results for EP elections in France since 1989, and they are quite chaotic. And they're even more chaotic for the two traditional governing parties, the Republicans and the Socialist Party, than for any other party. So what we should remember is that EP elections are always difficult for governing parties, but also for large parties more generally. Usually large parties lose in European elections. And this is what the second-order election model tells us. And in France, France is no exception in that regard. Out of the 9 EP elections we've had so far, only 3 were won by the governing party. So what I just wanted to say that EP elections more generally entail radically different results than national elections. This is one reason I'm hesitant to speak about realignments, and the other reasons I'm hesitant to speak about realignments in France is that it has been used to designate almost every single changes in the political landscape. And in France, you hear about realignment almost at any elections. We use it as a synonymous of alternance, which is, I think, not a right use of this concept. So I'm not going to use this concept, but anyway, I think we still need to look at the longer picture, at the rupture that happened in 2017. And this is what I'm going to do now, look at the period since 2015 and how we got to the current situation. So if we didn't witness a realignment, the question is, what exactly did we witness? Well, to answer this question, maybe let's look first of all at what happened and how we actually got there. So what happened? For the first time in the history of the Fifth Republic, the candidates of the two traditional governing parties were disqualified during the first round of the presidential elections. This was followed by a collapse of these two blocs, and one of these two blocs, the Socialist Party, even somewhat disaggregated into several movements. This is really an unprecedented configuration, but there are also many other things that came out of these elections. There was the highest share of parliamentary renewal after the 2017 legislative elections. There was a feminization of the National Assembly, with almost 40% of women now among the deputies. And there was also a very low participation rate in the following legislative elections. And what was also very peculiar about these presidential elections of 2017 was that the question that the parties faced very early on, so about 1 year before the election, the question that all the parties were facing was who is going to be against Marine Le Pen. So everyone was pretty sure that it would be Marine Le Pen against some other party. So if you think about it as a party, this may entail several different strategies. And in fact, I think what's really interesting in the presidential elections of 2017 is what it entails in terms of how the parties show their candidates for the elections. Before in France, there was still the idea that primary elections were an innovative, democratic, and successful way to choose the candidates. But the two parties that used them, the Republicans and the Socialist Party, failed to qualify for the second round. And now the image of primary is, of course, very negative. It's seen as a machine to lose, as having uncontrollable effects, and even as a factor of hysterization of the public debate. Because as you know, there's been a lot of tensions within both of the parties following the primaries. So apart from this first aspect, which was the disqualifications, I see two major parallel evolutions that also led to the transformation of the electoral competitions. And those are the rise of the National Front and the appearance of En Marche. But let me start by reminding that until recently, in France, most researchers found that the left-right political spectrum and its underlying social basis was what we observed in France, was the enduring map, was a simple map by which we could describe the political situation in France. And the French political landscape was firmly implanted along these dual cleavages of social class and religions since the 19th century, in fact. And so we had a strong right-left polarization. But as of the late 90s and early 90s, we started to speak about tripartition. So what's tripartition? It's the idea that the political space is divided into three blocks: the left, the moderate right, and the extreme right. And this, of course, is due to the appearance of the National Front. Why can we say that we have three blocks and that the left-right cleavage doesn't work anymore? Well, because the National Front was not able to be situated on these existing cleavages, while all of the new parties were able to be put on this left-right cleavage, even the Greens, for instance. So this was for the first major change of the political spectrum. Do I still have time? 6 minutes. Perfect. The other major change of on the right side of the political spectrum is, of course, the appearance of En Marche. En Marche is essentially an ad hoc structure. It's created from scratch to elect a leader, and then, in this sense, it's conformed totally to the Fifth Republic and to the central place of the presidential elections. If there was no presidential election, there would be no En Marche, basically. Its electorate is mostly a fusion of the electorate of the two pre-existing blocs, the center-left and the right. What I wanted to say that these two evolutions that grew in parallel, they're often interpreted either as a full sliding to the right of French politics or of a total reconfiguration of the political spectrum. My argument is that they're neither of those. They're probably in between these two. What we see is we still have two camps, so it doesn't change really the structure. We still have two camps. They're just different camps. So why did such evolution happen? I think there are, as when we explain any evolution, there are contextual elements and structural elements. Regarding the contextual reasons, those mean that they could not have happened anywhere else, basically. Those are the Penelope Gate. Have you heard about the Penelope Gate? So the Penelope Gate is the fact that the wife of the main candidate of the right was in a scandal, in a political financial scandal, where she actually was employed and paid for things that she never did. Like she was employed as an assistant for her husband, and she never worked there. And many different things, many different smaller scandals also were revealed regarding François Fillon, who was supposed to win this presidential election, to qualify to the second round and to win the presidential elections. The other contextual element might be, but of course it's difficult to measure, but it might be the fact that François Hollande decided not to rerun as a candidate, which is, of course, something very peculiar for the French system. Usually, the outgoing candidate goes for a second or tries to go for a second mandate. Then the structural reasons. Well, the structural reasons are very important. What we need to understand is that Macron and Le Pen did not by themselves turn the political system upside down. There are more structural elements. I see at least 3 structural elements. The first one, it's not only the defeat of the Socialist Party and the Republicans, but it's a failure of an organizational model. It's a failure of the traditional political party model. And in this sense, the presidential elections acted kind of an engine or an accelerator of this transition toward other party models. Well, there was already a crisis of political parties. And in fact, what's interesting is that if you think about it, the change from these 2 blocks to the 2 new blocks did not give rise to an institutional crisis at all. There was a party crisis, but not an institutional crisis. Emmanuel Macron, on the contrary, fully relies on the resources of the existing regime. The second structural element is maybe the extreme banalization of the far right in Europe. This also plays a role in the political spectrum in France. So Marine Le Pen would not like this, but probably it's an Europeanization of this banalization that actually allowed for this to happen. And of course, there is always the electoral system. Majority voting means that the dominant party sweeps everything, and this is exactly what happened. The presidential features of the system, they've really shown their full potential with the presidential and legislative elections of 2017. And in fact, I did not personally anticipate how strong the En Marche would actually win the legislative elections. The traditional parties, the Republicans and the Socialist parties, were not able to hold their constituencies, their baronies, their stronghold in the areas. They were all swept away by the République En Marche. So this kind of shows how the majoritarian system really went to its full potential at this point. For the remaining of my time, I wanted to look at the parties. Okay. And at the organization of the parties and of the electorate. So I'm going to go very quickly. En Marche, it's a party built against traditional parties, and it proposes a model that totally break with traditional practices. But it's still called the parties because it still fits the definition of the parties. First, as I already mentioned, it is marked by a strong personalization. It's created to elect a leader. Pierre Rosanvallon analyzes this personal dimension, and he says, it is a person who proposes to the society to identify with it. The political supplies determine the demand, whereas before it was the demand who was supposed to govern the supply. Second, what's really interesting, I think, with En Marche is the form of militancy that it involves, the forms of membership. It's what we could call a minimal formal membership on the internet, and also there is a very distant commitment of the new members. It's low cost, it's intermittent, it's little inclusive, if you'd like. Normally, there are traditional steps to achieve membership. It goes through sponsorship logic, it goes through some kind of social filtering. This is all not the case in En Marche. All these obstacles are removed. Registration is done on the internet and it's free. This allows a quick commitment. Why do they do that? Well, because it allows to display the image of a party that enjoys broad popular support, obviously, and this is kind of a logic of democratic demonstration that they're doing. And once you're a member, the platform, the digital platform, is still the main place, the main support for the party community. So the party is largely deterritorialized. And the big paradox is that decision-making is very centralized in the party. So this is this horizontally versus centralization of the party. What's very interesting in the structure of En Marche is that it really acts as a counter-model to the Socialist Party. So anything that the Socialist Party did in its organization, they do quite the opposite. For instance, there is no local section. They're trying to avoid party bureaucracy. They have no local baronies, which they see was a big problem in the Socialist Party. They have no factions, or they try not to have factions. But I would say that in the end, their organization still appears as rather poorly defined and a bit floating. Can I still have 1 minute?
Yeah, wrap up in 1 minute.
Okay. So I had more things to say on the organization of the national rally, but we can talk about that in the questions. Regarding the main challenges ahead. Well, normally we don't do prospects in political science. We always tell our students, please don't do prospective studies. This we can't do, but still I'm trying to show something that could happen in the next future, what we could expect. Well, in the perspective of the upcoming elections, especially the municipal elections of 2020, I think En Marche should be very satisfied with its relative victory, so its victory in the national elections and its second place in the European election. Why? Because it has weakened its competitor within the same social group. So there is not much any more parties in this that has the same electorate that En Marche. And this is why I would say that it's mostly En Marche that is the winner of the last contest. And in fact, the collapse of the Republicans, I don't know if it surprised anyone, it's just kind of a logical consequence. It follows immediately from the collapse of the Socialist Party, and this was really well anticipated by the realignment theory. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So thank you very much for this quick and thorough presentation. I think that now we have some minutes, maybe 7-10 minutes for Q&As. Whatever you prefer.
My question is, how was the key or determinant?
Hold on a second. Can we get a mic so they can translate after that?
Yes, my question is, how was determinant the change of the Front National when was the president Jean-Marie, the father, and now with Marie Le Pen? And the second question, with relation, is what future we can wait for the yellow belt, this movement, and the parties that are around this movement?
Do you want to answer right away, or do you prefer to get some questions and then?
I can answer, that's fine.
What, by one? Okay.
Thank you very much. Well, regarding the change from the National Front under Jean-Marie Le Pen to Marine Le Pen, of course, this was a big interrogation mark at the time, and in the early year, it didn't go so well, but very quickly, Marine Le Pen was able to actually really transform the party from inside, and this actually, one of the conditions to do that was actually to exclude her father from the party, strangely enough. I think that now we've almost forgotten that Jean-Marie Le Pen also made it to the second round of presidential elections. So in this regard, I think she managed to really modify the image. But if you look at the structure of the party, this is something I didn't have time to talk about, but it's still very obscure, it's still very centralized. What is different from the Jean-Marie time is that now they have a lot of local power bases, so they're able to actually rely on the people they got elected in the municipalities mostly, but also in the regions. And this has allowed them to develop some local contacts and local power bases that they didn't have before. So the party is roughly the same in terms of ideology, despite what she's trying to picture, but it's a bit different in terms of organization than it was at the time. Concerning the future of the Yellow Vest, well, the electoral results are disastrous, but I think that the Yellow Vest was always meant to be something different than the electoral parties. It was not meant to be parties, and that's why it never actually gained ground as parties or as something looking toward a party organization or any kind of organization. It's even difficult for them to designate like two representatives to go speak to the media. So of course, and I think that's their strengths, that they are out of the system and they want a different system. So in a sense, it's disappointing that this did not lead to more participation, this kind of questioning of the society. But on the other hand, this means that they can propose an alternative model to the society, or they want to. Then of course, it's the movement is really going down in terms of numbers. There have been lots of problems of who is in these movements, etc. So I'm rather skeptical about their future. Thank you.
We have the mic here, please.
Just a clarification. What do you mean for banalization of the radical right parties and ideas across Europe? I didn't get that point, so I would like to know a bit more.
Right. Well, what I mean is that while in France we had the Front National that was very active for a very long period of time, of course, as long as it was the only party in Europe or one of the only extreme right-wing parties in Europe, it was difficult to kind of have these ideas through. And now, because of the banalization of the discourse, not on that comes before that of the parties, they were actually able to subscribe to a kind of movement. For instance, now they're talking a lot to other parties in Europe. Even though I've never really understood what they're talking about concretely, but they formed this group in the European Parliament in 2014. It was one of the big question marks: would the Eurosceptic be able to actually have a group in the European Parliament? They had kind of 3 different groups, but still there was one group that, let's say, was really embodying this type of extreme right, at least. Maybe this is something we can discuss, the different types of extreme right. But yeah, that the fact that now it's everywhere and everyone has this. Not everyone, but some parts of this discourse.
So, any other question or comment?
Just 2 brief comments. Just 2 brief comments. The first one is about realignment. There are some works on the French party system. They argue that the real realignment took place in 2007 with the election of Sarkozy, because that was the first time that the party system was tripolar, with the right occupied by Sarkozy, successfully competing with the Front National, the National Front, the center with the Bayrou, and the left party. So that was the first time that the party system changed in a significant way, and then the National Front replaced the Sarkozy's party. And the second one is to what extent we can say that France had, before Macron and other new parties, traditional parties. Because if I look the Socialist Party and also the Gaullist or neo-Gaullist parties in the 80s and in the 90s, we cannot really compare to traditional parties as we know in other European, because of the presidential system, because of the local structures and legacies, the factionalism within the parties. So, I mean, I don't think they fit really well the traditional models of, let's say, mass or catch-all parties that we find in other places like Germany or even Italy or other countries in Europe.
Thank you very much. Well, for your second comment, I'm totally on board. I totally agree with that. The left, well, both sides are very peculiar on their own. The left is very peculiar because it's always been, because of its structure, as you explained, but also because of the alliances. They've been working a lot with the communist parties, for instance, which is something rather unusual. Regarding your first comments on realignment, this is exactly why I'm hesitant to use this wording regarding the French system, because in fact you can find scientific articles of French political scientists talking of each election as a realignment election. And in the 80s, with the appearance of the coming of the left to the power, in 2007, as closing the 2002-2007 period, this is perhaps a more convincing one so far. But what do we have after 2007? Kind of a similar situation as we had as before, so I don't really see this realignment that they all seem to see. So yes, this is exactly why I'm not using this word. Thank you.
A quick one, please, Oscar.
Yeah, a quick question on this party crisis, because I'm a bit shocked. 5 years ago, everyone was talking about party primaries. We all work on that by that time. And now the organizational structure has shifted to the personalized party with a very light structure and the man deciding everything. So could you tell us a bit more about that as a main factor of this, I don't know, realignment, but definitely party crisis? Thank you.
Well, I think political parties should have listened to political scientists a bit more, because we had warned them that primaries are very dangerous, but still they went with it. But not more seriously, I think that what the party used was really interesting, that the party used the primaries to try to resolve the party crisis, and it led to an even bigger party crisis in this. And so they used the primary to try to resolve the crisis, thinking by opening up the parties, they will give a better image of their party, and that's all that really mattered. But then, and that might actually be linked to also in France to the structure of the French parties, of course, this backfired because the parties are too divided, because there are too many tensions within the parties, and they were not able to designate consensual enough candidates within their parties. So this would be my answer to your question, but I don't know what they will invent next.
Okay, thank you very much, Camille. Thanks for the presentation and the Q&As. And with further ado, Manuela, would you join us here, please? Next speaker is Manuela Caiani from Scuola Normale Superiore of Florence, and talking about the Italian case in this regard. So whenever you want.
Okay, can I? Oh, well, I wanted to. Okay, you went. Okay, so thank you very much. It goes without saying, I'm very, very happy to be here. I think it's a great event. And so I'm very also happy to share these first reflections with all of you. And I contextualized the presentation within the big question, puzzle. What about Italy in terms of realignment? And actually, after the EU election, a better title, a title that would fit more for the Italian case, would have been now Italy, the right bloc. So, building on the previous presentation, I would say that in my view, the conclusion of my presentation could be, in Italy, in my view, we are now at the third step that you mentioned, Camille mentioned in terms of realignment processes. We had the shock, we had an intermediate phase, and now finally, the right is there. So not a populist right, but a full right, radical right, not ethno-regionalist anymore. But I will show you in details what I mean. So what are the goals? Or the empirical, let's say, research questions, that guidelines for this presentation. On the one hand, I would like to explore with you the right-wing competition in Italy, also in a cross-time perspective for the time we have. Since the end of the 19th, but especially after 2008, that of course represented a clear critical juncture, as we say in political science. But also I would like to link and try to understand that this is a shift of the Italian political party system vis-à-vis the Europe and the European election, but Europe in general. Finally, I also have tried to collect data on the sociology of the current radical right in Italy. Basically, I would like to show you who are they. So where do they come, all these voters from the League? Okay. Very quickly, some guiding concept, but more theoretical, then an overview of the populist radical right in Italy pre and post crisis, the role of the EU in domestic realignments, and I have framed this role in terms of framing of the radical right on the EU, but also strategies of alliances within the European context of elections. So what she just mentioned in terms of alliances and the idea to form a radical right European bloc. The scenario that we imagined before the European election, and now the results, some conclusions. I don't want to now to spend too much time here. Basically, I have tried to pick up, I draw, let's say, here and there on some political science concept, alignment, disalignment, but also causes and consequences of radical right populism, movement parties, frames, political opportunity structure. As you said, I come from social movement studies, so this is a very important concept for us, but also resources. Post-POS, political opportunity structure and the resources, in my view, here can help us to understand why the success of the radical right Northern League, the League, either in terms of the context, so the political opportunities, but also in, so the, let's say, the context, yeah, but also the resources of the actors. So what did they offer more to the Italian citizens that the other parties have not been able to offer? So supply and demand side elements. The radical right in Italy, a pre-crisis crisis overview. In terms of organizational resources, it has been always a very heterogeneous galaxy with many, many different actors, not only in terms of political parties. In Italy, the radical right was very fragmented in many, many tiny political parties fighting to each other, but also the variety was also strong for what concerned the non-political party milieu. So there were many cultural associations of radical right, sport and music groups. Now I don't enter into detail. I wrote a book in 2013 looking at this non-political party sector of the radical right in Italy, and which is, in my view, very important in order to build the cultural milieu on which then the institutional references, in this case the Northern League, is able to create the support. In terms of political and cultural opportunity structure, Italy have always, I would say, represented an open, favorable context for the radical right. Immediately after the Second World War, we didn't have the stigmatization of the radical right as, for instance, Germany has had. So the radical right represented by the Northern League entered in government since the mid of the 19th, together with Berlusconi. We had, at that time, two different radical rights. On the one hand, the National Alliance, neo-fascist Alleanza Nazionale, Fini, and the ethno-nationalist, at that time, Northern League. In terms of the EU, so the European context, it was not so politicized many years ago, and Italy was a traditionally pro-European country for many reasons. Then the shock, 2008, as we know, many causes that, let's say, nurtured the advancement of the radical right and populist radical right all over Europe. An economic crisis, political crisis, and cultural crisis. But if we look specifically at the Italian context, the main shock was in 2013 with that have been the most volatile ever national election in the history of the country. So also contingent factor and electoral system, as my colleague previously mentioned, are part of the context to be considered. Two new actors, Movimento 5 Stelle, that was the main protagonist, got at 25%, and so it appeared and immediately apparently consolidated its position, but only apparently, as we now we see, and then Northern League that scored a very bad result. There were also non-institutional radical right groups continuing to do political activities, I want to say. Casa Pound is one. Casa Pound is it was born as a social squatted center. Now I don't want to enter into detail, but my main point here is to insist always on the fact that in Italy we always have this non-political party sphere very active and very often locally connected with the radical right political parties. So for instance, Northern League has many links with the Forza Nuova at the local level and so on and so forth. 2008 national elections, the League now rebranded, then I will enter into details, and the Movimento 5 Stelle, the winners, the League with 17% and Movimento 5 Stelle around 33%. So the relationship of the mutual strength of the two governing parties was still in 2008, so 1 year ago, in favor of Movimento 5 Stelle. They are two types of populism, inclusionary, exclusionary. The definition of Movimento 5 Stelle within the category of inclusionary left-wing populism, as you know better than me, is very contested. Also, not only some scholars usually defined Movimento 5 Stelle as hybrid, but if we look closely to the changes of Movimento 5 Stelle, especially on some sensitive issues like immigration, the conception of citizenship in the last year, so if you look at the speeches, official, unofficial, interviews, and so on and so forth, here I relied on many empirical research I have done, you can clearly see a movement toward the right. So the rightist, let's say, component of the Movimento 5 Stelle was evident in the last year. It changed a bit now, just before the election. So the left-wing component appeared to be somehow more active, let's say. Euroscepticism has been considered the main glue of these two forces of government. Now, of course, as you know, 2019 administrative plus European election, the Northern League was the champion with 32% of the vote, and the Movimento 5 Stelle lost 12% of vote. So in 1 year, this party lost 12%. Again, in terms of now, I will skip this. Just to let you know that this heterogeneity also continue in the post-crisis situation. These two main actors of realignment, let's see a bit more their characteristics and details. As you probably know, the big change in the Northern League political party has been in 2002 with a change of leadership from the founding father Umberto Bossi to Salvini, and the rebranding, nationalizing, and transnationalizing. So the Northern League stopped to be only the party of the North, with having as main enemy Roma Ladrona, so the center, and the south of Italy, but it became a full populist radical right party. On the one hand, a party of the nation, and this is evident now in the electoral flows of the votes in this last election. So where did they did pick up votes, and with two new enemies, not new, but I mean clearly now the enemies. On the one hand, the European Union, on the other hand, the immigrants, according to the rhetoric of the traditional exclusionary populist right in Europe. Movimento 5 Stelle, it has been called also a franchise party. The breakout was in 2013, polyvalent or eclectic populism. It appeared as normalized as a party, entering into institutions, and changing the political party system, but actually, as you can see, Tronconi, who is a colleague, a party politics scholar, quite always active in research, said this in 2008, but now, surprise. The role of the EU institution in domestic realignment. If we look at the demand side of the radical right success, we can see clearly that since 2008, a bit before, but 2008, the Italian citizens' attitudes toward Europe started to become very negative. I mean, they are decreasing since 2000, but 2008 marked a clear decrease in pro-European attitudes of the Italian citizens. So it means that if you are a party that capitalize on this content, you can be successful. Of course, so the crisis, these three crises, I would say, opened up a discursive opportunity structure that was, at the beginning, used both from the Movimento 5 Stelle and the Northern League. But continuing, they show two different types of anti-EU frames. On the one hand, we have the League, which construct, within the framework of a populist appeal, a nativist frame. And so usually the Euroscepticism of the Northern League toward the European Union is, on the one hand, cultural, on the other hand, economic. And the economic one usually is justified, the cultural one is justified with economic arguments. So basically they are racist and nativist. However, they use also the economic frames. So the usual justification saying that the immigrants steal the jobs to Italian, welfare system cannot cover immigrants because they are many frames that you know. In Movimento 5 Stelle, the Eurocriticism has been articulated more from the very beginning on a basis of an economic and political criticism. So the European Union, of course, is criticized as the Northern League, and here the glue, the possible nexus, on the economic field, so austerity measures, the lack of a social European protection. But on the other hand, it is especially the political criticism mobilized by the Movimento 5 Stelle. So Europe is a non-democratic institution, and so on and so forth. Now I'll skip here. In terms of strategies, so this slide is already old because we know that this didn't happen. But what happened? What was one possible scenario before the European election? As we know, Salvini, but also other leaders of the radical right in Europe tried to link to each other in order to form an European group, or better, to reinforce the current European alliance of nations. And there was this conference, you probably know, in April 2009, with the title "For a Common Sense Europe." I have translated common sense. It would have been a Europe of del buon senso. So, by the way, a meeting with the main radical right leaders in Europe, Northern League, the leader of Alternative für Deutschland, the Finns Party, Das Volkspartei, in order to link all these parties. Also the non-political party sector, let me say, Casa Pound, so the more movimentistic radical right, was searching for European alliances before the European elections. So this is to say that Europe really was, these elections were important for them. They have been conceived as a test, not only for the radical right in government, but also for the Italian radical right overall, as a possibility, as an opportunity, not as a problem, or as a neutral event, as it has been So will they conquer the EU? I went to a conference before the EU presenting this. This was one possible scenario. Yes, I said they can reach a majority. More specifically, then I will show you. If they can reach, I said, 110 seats, increasing the number of people within the Europe of Nations group, but also picking up here and there seats like it has been counted 12 from Alternative für Deutschland, plus some single MPs from Eastern and Central European countries, and here and there. So it was imagined in a worst scenario that the radical right in Europe could have a sort of quasi-majority, together with the alliance in an alliance together with the conservative, the ECR. This scenario would have imagined if they reach enough vote together with the conservative, then probably they can become a sort of pivotal political actor, and the popular European party can also ally with them. This didn't happen, we know, but anyway, the European election brought about this historical result for the Northern League. As you see, in 2004, the 2014, election, the Northern League had just 6% of the vote. Now she had almost the triple. So, what are the challenges ahead for Italy, but also for the European Union as a whole in terms of the radical right? As I already mentioned, this election has been a test for the Italian government, a test that clearly marked a victory of the League. So we can now talk, in my view, without any doubt, of a bloc of the radical right in Italy, with Northern League as a leader, but also, as we know, Forza Italia still there with almost 9%, but also a smaller formation that actually was not so unfortunate in this election, the neo-fascist Fratelli d'Italia. They got 6.5. So all these parties together, they reach almost 50% of the vote. In terms of content, what is the agenda of Matteo Salvini after the European election? I would say a mix of liberalism in economy plus social protectionism in sort of welfare, as we know, chauvinism, social protectionism, so flat tax, is the high-speed railway public infrastructure, benefits for rich regions, security, and a stricter immigration control. Where they come from, these votes? I said sociology of the radical right, but this is not true. Actually, this is just the political aspect. So I'm not saying anything now in terms of socio-demographic characteristics and so on and so forth. But where did they come from? If we compare the Northern League 2008 national Italian election and now 2019, we see clearly that the Northern League drained, so they had the votes from Movimento 5 Stelle and partly also from Berlusconi, and from those that previously were abstained, so abstention. So they picked up from these three parties, the party of the abstention, Berlusconi and Movimento 5 Stelle. They are in Italian, excuse me, but mainly you can see that 17% of those that previously voted for Movimento 5 Stelle in 2019 voted for the League. And 14 of those that didn't vote. So when we talk about the great surprise of a turnout participation for this European election, this coming back to politics of many people actually went in this direction, at least in Italy. So, to the contrary, if we look in a parallel way to the Movimento 5 Stelle 2018-2019, we see that their voters mainly they were disillusioned and they went either to the abstention or they have been conquered by Salvini. So if we compare to European election 2014, 2009, the League plus 3 million of votes, looking in absolute terms also is very useful to understand the weight of, so plus 3 million of vote, Movimento 5 Stelle minus 6 million. And who are they? I mean, in terms of across national distribution, we see that finally the League is really the party of the overall country. The vote is nicely distributed all across the country. And in terms of age, baby boomers here are defined those Italians born from between 1946 and 1964. So my father, let's say, is a baby boom. The baby boomers went in mass, I wrote here, I don't know, but mass movement from Movimento 5 Stelle and Berlusconi to the League. The X generation in this case is defined as those born between 1965 and 1979, so me. Big transfer of vote from Movimento 5 Stelle to the League. The millennials, as you know, those born after the 80s, Movimento 5 Stelle lost most of them, and the League and also the Democratic Party, so the usual social left-wing party in Italy, traditional one, are liked more by these voters. So, conclusion. In Italy, I would say that the European election also represented, so what we can say about the characteristics of Italian politics today, especially within the context of this European election. In my view, as far as Italy is concerned, I can say that in Italy, populism, so this European election also showed, let's say, the failure of, in my view, not the populist dream, but the populist interpretation. So a politics that try to interpret politics without the axis left-right actually in Italy was not true or sustainable. The populist League is clearly a right party, and the left-wing populist Movimento 5 Stelle that was not so leftist, but a mixed position in a hybrid shape, it was not successful. By the way, first feature, a consolidation in Italy of the bloc of the right with Salvini leader. It's a social bloc, so it has social origins and social reasons. Basically, it combines successfully fear and poverty. So those that are threatened, or at least they perceive to be threatened by many changes, cultural changes, immigration, and those who are or feel in a relative deprivation situation in terms of poverty. Salvini has a leader, so here I would say the causes, but there are also the supply side. Salvini has a leader who has been able to give voice to them, to dominate the political discourse, to occupy the media, to also nurture racism, construct a political hegemony over the center-right, and also, I would say, over the Movimento 5 Stelle. Content agenda, a mix of lib-pop, a mix of liberalism plus populism in social policies. And in Europe, in my view, we are far from a consolidation of a bloc of the right. able to modify European policies. The bloc of the right clearly comes from Italy, Poland, and Hungary, where the right is in government. In France and UK, the right was the first in electoral support, but still have no impact on the government. It was significant in Austria and Belgium, although in Austria already out of the government. Plus, the right stabilized within a political niche, I would say, in other countries like Germany, Greece, Spain, Northern Europe. So, without the exception of Italy, Poland, and Hungary, in none of the other European countries, I would say the right has the hegemony on the political system as it has in these three countries. But this is not to normalize or banalize the radical right, to say that, in my view, if we look at the European scenery, we had not have the scenario that I presented you before with a quasi-majority. That was one expected scenario. Yeah, that's all. Thank you a lot.
Thank you, Manuela. Thank you for this thorough and quick and intense presentation. So again, we have some time for questions.
Thank you very much. Just a question and a comment. The question is, which is the source of your data on electoral transfers? I mean, if this data is generated by a post-electoral survey, it's splendid because it's in less than 1 week. So we have to learn about that, how to have post-electoral surveys in less than 1 week. Second question, what about comparing such a different election? That's to say, we know that European elections are second or third or fourth order elections, and then usually voters use protest vote or even experimental voting rather than a conscience vote. What do you think about that? Could it explain such of movements that you presented? Thank you.
Okay. So for what concerns the data, actually they are, where did I wrote the source? The source is this institution of research, Cratesis data with plus several European partners. Actually, they are still have been not published. They are based, these of course, they were based on a sample of, on a survey, a electoral survey. And these actually is still, these other are still based on these pre-electoral surveys, but the numbers have been recalibrated, I don't know how to say it, readjusted after the election. So actually, yes, this institution of research have been able to, the sample is made of, it is a representative sample in Italy, statistically representative, of 80,000 voters, electors resident in Italy. The data, the survey has been conducted according to a CATI, CAMI, CAWI method, and so on and so forth. So yes, actually they are not just vote intention, but they sum up vote intention plus. And about the second order European election, I am one of those who think that they are not anymore second order election. So I think that this movement, this change actually between a situation in which European elections were second order election and a situation where they are fully salient elections is almost, so we are still in between, but we are going toward this direction. In my view, this was an extra, of course, factors of the results. Yes, for sure. This is visible also in the electoral programs of at least in Italy. I remember then in Italy when there was the constitutional process in Europe, 2005, for instance, I remember that this process of constitution building in Italy was not covered at all, nor by media. The only mention media usually did was about the Catholic preamble. So I remember that really everything was Italianized, can I say that? So not the media and the political parties did the same. So Europe was not talked about, discussed as Europe. For this election, they constructed an European campaign, and so, yeah, at least in Italy, I saw a lot of Europe in their political campaigning.
More questions, comments for Manuela's presentation?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your presentation. That was really interesting. Actually, my first question relates to what you just said and your impression that they're not second-order elections anymore. And my question was, how would you interpret the results of the 2014 European election then in this electoral sequence that you've just described? And especially the results of the Democratic Party, that was kind of extraordinary in this regard. And maybe a second question, at some point you mentioned that there was a decrease of pro-European attitudes among Italians, and that's one of the factors explaining possibly the rise of the extreme right.
A decrease.
A decrease of pro-European attitudes,
yes,
or an
course.
increase of anti-European attitudes.
Yes.
Anyway. And my question is it the egg or the chicken? Isn't it the other way around? Or is Europe so salient that it's now able to actually bring parties to power in this sense?
Sure.
Thank you.
No, I start with the second question. Of course, it's a question that I also have in my mind. So it's what is the first element and what is the second one? Now, in my view, let's say the Movimento 5 Stelle on the one hand and the League on the other, they have been very able to capitalize on this change on European attitudes within Italian society. So what the anti-European and Eurosceptics appeals that differently these parties diffused in the last few years would have been impossible in Italy 10 years ago, 15 years ago. In my view, it's part of a normalization of several things that you mentioned before. Also, the normalization of the right in Italy started first. So we had this normalization of the right very well in advance. It is not by chance that we also, as far as immigration, my colleagues that work on immigration policies talk for Italy about securitarization of the issue with the Northern League in government. So we have a sort of sdoganamento, so the exit from stigmatization of many discourses. This for what concerns radical right. The European Union, the pro-European Union mood was still there, in my view, until few years ago for the majority of citizens. Then, after the euro, as we know, so there were, of course, some, again, critical juncture structural that determined a change. But these entrepreneurs of the political support have been really skillful. Now, about your first question, probably I didn't get very well the point, the comparison between 2014 and 2019. In 2014, I didn't understand probably what was the point in terms of the League success. So
the point is that you're analyzing a sequence of elections, and I wanted to see what does it represent in terms of European elections in this sequence, because we started in 2013.
So okay. No, okay, understood. No, the 14 European election was not so. They were very good for the Movimento 5 Stelle. It scored 21. Northern League, if I'm not mistaken, and now I don't remember constantly. It was bad. It was a 6, as I said. Previously, the Northern League in the European election 2009, it scored a good result. So let's say in terms of European election, the Northern League in 2009 scored, yes, a quite acceptable result. So it was a bit fuzzy, as it was fuzzy the trend of the Movimento 5 Stelle, but in terms of after 2014, the Northern League, the league was always on the increase. This is why I started from 2014, but probably we can discuss that better in person, since I still continue not to understand what is, so I'm not satisfactory in my answer. Okay.
Next question, please.
Yes. My question is about the past of the Salvini. During the last years, he was linked with different movements in Europe, but especially in Spain and Italy, movements for the rights of the towns and people. These actions in the political life of Salvini, what do you think? Was a strategy, political strategy, or in real he is inside the right, but he think he support in the future these movements, or he will be like Berlusconi, a centralist? What do you think? And link with this, what do you think about the measures, actions against the P2 in English is propaganda 2? What do you think?
Thank you. No, thank you for these questions, since especially the second one touches exactly one topic I usually focus on, which is the radical right on the web. So the diffusion of the radical right discourses on websites, but also social media and so on. So I will start from this one. And what I think about the future. Usually, at least in the comparative research I have done, Italy, together with Spain, actually, is one of the countries that has no a strict policy against hate speeches or the propagation of radical right, sometimes violent or discriminatory propaganda on the web. For instance, Germany had many more laws, Northern European countries as well. So in terms of laws online against specifically radicalized discourses that we can call hate speeches and so on, of the radical right, Italy is not very well equipped. We have, for instance, Legge Mancini of 1993, which has been now transposed for what concerns the social media and the online, but it is totally is not a good framework, I would say. Is not able to cover all the occurrences. For what concerns the second point, during the presentation of my colleague that I liked a lot, the new party slides at the end, for instance, I was thinking about when you presented these characteristics of the new party and the light format in terms of membership, everything online, the social contacts are reduced. I was thinking about the Northern League, the League, because I was thinking, okay, it's true. Matteo Salvini now, contrary than the previous leadership, Umberto Bossi, is very able, also skillful, also in using social media and Twitter, as we know. So he also entered this online sphere. However, and this is the strength of the League, in my view, the League doesn't abandon this social penetration, social roots. And this is, in my view, the strength of the League in Italy, also comparing to other parties like Berlusconi. The Northern League have been able to reproduce I would say, the structure of the traditional mass party somehow, because it has plenty of local sections, social in my view, this was a characteristic from the very beginning. So I would not talk about strategy, or better, of course, the boundaries between strategies, intentional strategies, and vocation, let's say, are sometimes are difficult to be traced, but really the Northern League from the very beginning was characterized by a social penetration. And this is also what citizens liked more. And I stop with an anecdote. I don't know. I come from Tuscany, which is a subcultural red-wing region. But also in my regions, talking with many peoples, since many years ago also, people that were voting for the Democratic Party, however, they liked a lot this presence of the Northern League on the street. Not in Tuscany, I mean, there was not Northern League until a few years ago in Tuscany, but I mean, they appreciated, saying, okay, I vote for the PD, but look, what do? They really are close to citizens. This is something, in my view, was very strong in this party. So I don't think just strategy.
Okay, thank you very much, Manuela, for your presentation and answers.
Thank you.
Muy rápido. Hold on a second. There was another one that I
I
had not seen it, so it was my fault.
I mean, my question was a little bit off topic, so maybe, but well, you were pointing about, Bossi, and I'm very curious, how the Northern League, I can't understand how a regionalist, populist, but not so racist party became this. I mean, which changes have happened in that party in 5 years to become something, I don't know if so different, or is it if it's just only an evolution, but at least in the territorial level is a radical change.
Okay. Ethno-regionalism, let me, if we reflect in terms of Roccan cleavages, no? We know that ethno-regionalism is along the axis center-periphery, so it doesn't have, it's not overlapping, and very often it's perpendicular, the axis right-left. However, in some countries, ethno-regionalism is closer to the left. I don't want to say something very wrong, but for instance, also the Basque country or the Irish country, they are a bit closer, or they have been in other countries closer to the right. Italy, the Northern League in Italy has been always, and this has been manifested also in the alliances they did, closer to the right. So also when they were an ethno-regionalist party, of course their main cleavage was center-periphery, and therefore the main enemy was the center, Rome. But the positions they had on other issues were never progressive positions. For instance, on immigration, the Northern League was always had always a nativist position. But simply before the main the main cleavage for their identification was the center-periphery one. And then there has been a movement here I would say strategic, towards a proper and fully radical right discourse and nature. But it was there from the very beginning, in my view. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Manuela, again. And now I think that we are changing sides here. We have the next, So next we are having the Greek case.
Cas a Grècia.
We have the privilege again
Tenim també un
to
privilegi
have Susannah Verney from the
Susannah
National and
Verney
Kapodistrian
de la
University of Athens.
Universitat National and Kapodistrian de
To improve
Atenes.
the
este és el
rankings
nom.
and impact.
Okay, so I would also like to start by thanking the organisers for inviting me to this workshop. And it's a real pleasure to be here. This is my first visit to Valencia, and I hope it will not be my last. So, the Greek case, the headlines, okay? The Greek far right reappeared on the political scene just 15 years ago, basically, when a Greek far-right party was re-elected to the European Parliament and then made an electoral breakthrough into the national parliament 12 years ago. There's clearly a market for the Greek far-right. It's become established as part of the political scene, but it doesn't have a stable representation. We've had a changing face of the far-right in comparison to the mainstream right, which has remained stable from 1974 onwards. We have had the same party, New Democracy, one of the basic poles of the post-dictatorship political system. And New Democracy has survived as one of the two basic poles of the Greek party system in comparison to the socialist PASOK, which of course has shrunk to become a minor party. One of the points that I want to make is that the various kind of breakthrough points for the far right in Greece have been linked with major popular mobilizations, and I'm going to give you 4 key examples. And it's also, of course, been very much influenced by the policy of the mainstream right and the relationship of the mainstream right to the far right. And the headline from the European Parliament election, which happened on Sunday, is that although it follows another of these major mobilizations, it actually saw a decline in the overall electoral strength of the far right, which is very interesting. Now, in order to explain to you where I think we are today, I'm going to do a kind of quick retrospective on the far right in Greece, also because I imagine that this is not a case that's particularly familiar to most people in this audience. So let me start off very briefly by saying in the immediate post-dictatorship period, we had the representation in 1977 of a far-right party in the national parliament. It was a pro-monarchist and pro-juntist party. So what we had, in fact, in the 1970s and 1980s were what I call one-hit wonders. They're parties which make it into one parliament or one European parliament, and that's all. They don't serve another term, and they were all nostalgics for previous regimes. So they're a very old-fashioned far-right, whose electoral base was literally dying out, as in fact some of their MEPs as well while they were in service. So the point about the national camp was that in the 1981 election, this party was actually absorbed into the mainstream right. New Democracy invited the party leader to run on the ballot paper in 1981, and therefore the far right disappeared from the national parliament for a generation. From then on, especially given the almost hegemonic position that the Socialist Party was establishing within the Greek political system, which meant that for right-wing voters, voting against the Socialists was more important than actually expressing support for the far right, it actually meant that the far right basically disappeared. And we had these 2 minor parties in the European Parliament, but they really were very minor. So then the first of our major mobilizations is the Macedonia mobilization in 1992. There is only one Macedonia and it's Greek. This, of course, I'm sure you're familiar with this. It's the big issue which has been tormenting Greek politics for more than a quarter of a century over whether our northern neighbor can actually use the word Macedonia in its name. And this is actually a key issue. The Macedonian question has been crucial in nourishing the far right in Greece. And it's a flagship issue for every single far right formation, large or small. So it's very important. By the way, this demonstration that you can see, which took place in Thessaloniki, apparently had 2 million participants, which in a country of less than 12 million people is pretty astonishing. And the Macedonian mobilization produced its own child, which was Political Spring. But this was a flash party. It was a party that was elected once to the national parliament, once to the European Parliament, and then disappeared. But it was very important as the first non-mainstream right-wing party after the end of the Cold War. It was a breakaway from the mainstream right, so it wasn't something that emerged from the various far-right groupuscules that had always been around. It was led by Andonis Samaras, the former New Democracy foreign minister, and it was basically a one-issue nationalist party focusing on the Macedonian question. It wasn't nativist, it didn't have an anti-parliamentary discourse. It was increasingly Eurosceptic, but by the time that Political Spring actually moved further to the right in the late 1990s, it had actually disappeared as an electoral force. So most analysts don't actually classify it as a far-right party, but it is a party to the right of the mainstream right. And then we have another major mobilization in the year 2000 over the identity cards, What prompted this was the decision by the National Data Protection Agency to say that religious affiliation could no longer be listed on identity cards. And this produced a massive popular mobilization. It was seen as a major threat to national identity and a major attack on Hellenism because of the very close relationship between Orthodoxy and Hellenism. Orthodoxy is regarded as absolutely fundamental to Hellenism. There's this kind of myth about the Orthodox Church keeping national identity, whatever that was, alive during the Ottoman period. And these protests were actually led by the Orthodox Church, which was also, it also emerged under a very activist archbishop as a leading opponent of globalization. And of course, the key of this is it occurred after a decade of immigration. And the party that emerged from this, not coincidentally having the word orthodoxy in its name, was Laos, Greece's first real radical right party, founded by a former New Democracy member of parliament, but it linked up very rapidly with minor far-right groups. So it actually moved very, very fast further to the right. And it was based on its leader, Karatsaferis, who was a TV personality. You can see him here in this poster. The party was nativist, is nativist, it still exists just about, anti-immigrant, anti-Semitic, anti-Turkish, very strong anti-Turkish line, Macedonian question, anti-Euro, Europe of nations, and also a lot of anti-parliamentary discourse, critical of parties and supporter of a strong executive presidency. Now, Laos had its electoral breakthrough to the European Parliament in 2004, to the National Parliament in 2007, since when we have had far-right parties continually represented in both of those institutions. And surprisingly, for a party which started as a breakaway from one of the two main parties, for the first time actually in Greece, we had the re-election of a party that started as a breakaway from New Democracy to both the European and national parliaments in 2009, so it seemed to have stabilised. Its highest vote shares, you can see here, 5.6% in the national election and 7.1% in the European Parliament election. It established hegemony over the far-right space, but it's a marginal, minor, permanent opposition party in a well-established two-party system in which the two main parties are getting around 80% of the vote together. And here, just this quick slide shows that if we look at the mainstream right and the far right together, we can see that the far right during this pre-crisis period, 2004 to 2009, its vote share compared to that of the mainstream right is really small. Even in the 2009 parliamentary election, where it gets its highest vote share, it's still less than a quarter of the total votes going to parties of the right. But then we have our third mass mobilization, which is, of course, the economic crisis, the anti-Troika demonstrations. And these demonstrations have not just protests against austerity, but they're also protests about the loss of sovereignty during the crisis and the big national humiliation, the discourse, the anti-Greek discourse, particularly in the German press. You know, things like, you wicked Greeks, sell the Acropolis to pay off the debt, and so on. And so, of course, the headline with regard to the far right during the crisis, the picture that I'm sure we all have in our minds is Golden Dawn, the emergence of Golden Dawn, which is an openly Nazi party. There is this famous video just before the 2012 elections where the leader, Mr. Michailolakos, who you can see here you can see him doing a Nazi salute. He actually says on video, we are the nationalists, the national socialists, the fascists. And the point about Golden Dawn is that it's not just a party, it's also a paramilitary organization. And you can see their so-called security battalions here. The name harks back, by the way, to the security battalions of the Second World War occupation, which is also very important to Golden Dawn's discourse. So during the crisis, the far right actually becomes a player. In the previous period, it's emerged, but it's very minor. In the crisis, it becomes a player. It becomes a significant electoral force. The decline in support of the two major parties, which I imagine you're aware of, the two major parties dropped from an average of 8 in 10 voters before the crisis. They dropped to 1 in 3 in the May 2012, what I call the protest election of May 2012. It opens space not just for the rise of the radical left, of course, which becomes parliamentary force, but also for the far right, which achieves its maximum vote share in that protest election of May 2012, 20.5%. 1 in 5 are actually voting for far-right parties. Its maximum vote share in the Euro election is actually a bit less, a couple of years later, 15.5%. But in 2015, in 2014 European Parliament election and the 2015 elections, it becomes third party. Golden Dawn becomes third party without increasing its vote share, but because the other parties have lost so much. Another key point about the crisis is that it legitimates the far right as a government participant in governing coalitions. We often forget that Laos took part in a coalition with PASOK and New Democracy between 2011 and 2012, the coalition that negotiated Greece's second EU-IMF bailout. And then, of course, we have the independent Greeks partnered with Syriza, which you probably all remember, because that coalition only ended just a few months ago. But at the same time, what also happens during the crisis is we have a changing face of the far right, indicating instability. We have the emergence of new parties. So Laos is replaced by Golden Dawn, but also by the independent Greeks. And we have this kind of reconfiguration in the right-wing space with the second bailout. First of all, the second bailout splits Laos, and leading cadres of Laos actually join New Democracy. So it's quite important to remember that New Democracy actually absorbs part of the far right at this point. But at the same time, the second bailout also splits New Democracy itself, and it results in the emergence of a new party, the breakaway independent Greeks, which is a party based on those in New Democracy who voted against the second bailout. And it was, I believe, 21 members of the Greek parliament from New Democracy actually voted against it. So the independent Greeks becomes the polite face of the far right. It's a kind of acceptable alternative to those who don't want to vote for Golden Dawn. Meantime, in 2012, New Democracy, in response to this split, moves towards far-right positions on immigration. It adopts the far-right agenda in the May 2012 election with a disastrous electoral result because it essentially legitimates Golden Dawn. New Democracy falls to 18.5% of the vote in this election, which is its worst ever electoral score, beyond the worst dreams of the party leadership. So one of the things that we see during the crisis period is, you can see here, that the far right is taking an increasing share of the right-wing vote. If you look at the May 2012 election, in fact, the far right has more, 20.5% compared to 18.5% for New Democracy. That 20.5%, however, is the three parties added together. That drops, the far right is getting, as you can see here, 16% in the follow-up election in June, 11.1% in January of 2015, so vote share dropping, 10.7% in September of 2015, but nevertheless, compared to the pre-election, the pre-crisis figures that I showed you, the far right is clearly still a much more important component of the right than at any point before the crisis. So what's been happening recently? Well, we've had another big mobilization. This is the big anti-Prespa agreement mobilization, which occurred last year in 2018. This is the one in Thessaloniki. There was also another big demonstration in Athens earlier this year. So the Prespa agreement, as I'm sure you all know, was the agreement between the Greek government and the government of what we now call North Macedonia, that this country could, in fact, have a name that included the term Macedonia. And this was a major rallying point for political discontent, again, and also, of course, a major opportunity for nationalist mobilizations. So it's my fourth major mobilization. And what this has done was it was believed that this was opening up a lot more space for the far right. You can see this, there are actually 8 different far-right parties contesting the 2019 Euro elections, including some that we had never heard of before. And what happens in the election, there is a 3% threshold for entry to the European Parliament. So you can see that there are only 2 winners here. 2 parties clearly emerge as the leading parties on the far right, which is Golden Dawn, and a new party called Greek Solution. So the winners and losers on the right from the Greek Euro election, we have the electoral demise of the 2 parties which had formerly participated in governments. Okay, the independent Greeks, less than 1%, and the definitive demise of the former government participant Laos, which, despite linking up with one of the former Golden Dawn Euro MPs, only got 1.2% of the vote, and whose leader has announced that he's definitively retiring from politics. But we also have the first decline in Golden Dawn's vote share, and this is generally regarded as very significant because since Golden Dawn broke through in 2012, it has been doing very well. Its vote share just doesn't decline. And it's actually lost 48% of its 2014 European Parliament vote, but it's also 1/3 of its 2015 vote, not 2019. And at the same time, we have the electoral breakthrough by the new far-right party Greek Solution, which means that we'll have, again, 2 far-right Greek parties in the European Parliament, as in the previous Parliament, but now it's Greek Solution rather than the independent Greeks. The total far-right vote is down 18%, despite all these offers, 8 different parties that you could choose from. It's down 18% compared to 2014, which I think is very significant in the context of the anti-Prespa mobilization. But we should also mention some contextual features here. The decline of Golden Dawn. The decline of Golden Dawn is due to some things which have been going on with the party itself. We have the murder of... Golden Dawn was well known that it went around and murdered people, but they weren't Greeks, so people didn't pay much attention. But then, in September of 2013, they murdered a Greek, an anti-fascist rapper called Pavlos Physos. And this is a key point in the electoral fortunes of the party, because not immediately, but it does seem to have turned people gradually against the party. And in April 2015, sorry, not April 2019, I had a few black spots here when I was doing these slides. The Golden Dawn trial opened 4 years ago. The 69 defendants include all the members of parliament elected in 2012, and particularly the party leader, Mr. Mihalioulakos himself, who in fact was in jail for 18 months. In pre-trial detention, but had to be released after 18 months because you can't keep people in jail for more than 18 months without a trial. The charges include the murder of Pavlos Physos and another murder of an immigrant, and also running a criminal organisation. And gradually this seems to have eroded confidence of some of its former supporters in the party. One of the very significant things that has happened, Golden Dawn's organisation has been very much on the local level, and it built quite a strong network of local branches which have been shrinking. Its branches have been closing, particularly over the last couple of years. And then in the Euro election, there was a very spectacular split with its former MEPs, because the party leader, not wanting one of the key cadres, Mr. Lagos, to turn against him and give evidence against him in the trial, guaranteed him election to the European Parliament. So he put him on the ballot and removed the previous MEPs, and this also caused a lot of disaffection. Just a few words about Greek Solution, which describes itself as a patriotic and social alliance. It's a nativist party. It doesn't actually use the word refugee. It regards anybody who enters the party enters the country without papers as an illegal immigrant who should be expelled, regardless of if they're fleeing the war from Syria or whatever. Citizenship should only be for those with 2 Greek parents, which I have to say is a bit tough on my own kids, but there you go. The people should take power into their hands through referendums, and its support base is essentially in Macedonia. So actually this party has been mobilizing very much around the Macedonian question. One of the things that we should say here, the Greek far right is always quite pro-Russian, but this party is very much more openly pro-Russian than anything we've seen before. And in fact, many analysts actually describe it as an agent of Russian influence. So where, for example, Golden Dawn's policy was national economic autarky, Greek Solutions policy is that we should have a major change in our external orientation, building strong trading links with Russia. The other point you may be wondering about this picture on the left, this is the party leader, Mr. Velopoulos. Mr. Velopoulos has an interesting history because he started off in the Hellenic Front, which was a little minor groupuscule. He joined Laos, along with, in fact, the entire leadership of Hellenic Front in the mid-2000s. He left Laos with the second bailout split in 2012 and became a New Democracy MP. And then he left New Democracy in 2015 to form his own party. The other thing that's important to know about Mr. Velopoulos is that he is well known to Greek voters because he's a telly personality. And he, like Mr. Karatsaferis, okay, television has actually been key. And what he is known for on television is actually being a TV salesman. And so among the things he sells are these wonderful pills which are supposed to restore all your ills. In fact, the most notorious thing that he tried to sell on TV was a manuscript which he claimed was letters written by Jesus Christ himself. Yeah, so you can imagine that the Twitter sphere has been full of a lot of comments since he actually got elected to Parliament. Now, I think one of the important things to mention about the European Parliament election is actually what this European Parliament election is. It's a very big victory for New Democracy. Not just has New Democracy emerged as first party, 33%, so 9.5% ahead of the governing Syriza, but it's also clearly moving to re-establish its hegemony over the right-wing space, because that right-wing space is shrinking. Even with all those parties that were on offer, it was only 12.7%. And at the moment, we only have 2 players. We should also mention, though, that, of course, we would prefer to have mainstream right-wing parties than far-right parties, but we should bear in mind that this victory in this Euro election has been accompanied by a significant rightward shift of New Democracy itself. After the 2015 election defeat, New Democracy elected a new leader, Kyriakos Mitsotakis, who initially aimed to take the party towards the centre. And this became completely, this strategy was completely jettisoned with the major opportunity that the party saw with the anti-Prespa mobilizations. The opinion polls were showing that the overwhelming majority of Greeks were against the Prespa agreement. And so both New Democracy and, I may say, PASOK, the now very small socialist party, joined the anti-Prespa movement. And New Democracy played a big role in this anti-Prespa movement itself. The 2 gentlemen I'm showing you here are 2 former Laos MPs, Mr. Voridis and Mr. Georgiadis, who are important members of New Democracy. Mr. Georgiadis is actually one of the party's 2 vice presidents. And generally, the right wing of New Democracy is now dominant. And that includes Mr. Samaras, who was, of course, the leader of Political Spring in the 1990s and then became the Prime Minister and made the disastrous shift towards the far right that I mentioned before in 2012. So we seem to have a shrinking of the far right. We seem to have New Democracy returning in strength. Of course, we're in the middle of the episode here because we now have national elections due to be held on the 7th of July. So it remains to be seen what happens there. And certainly there, everything is to play for with Greek solution. Will Greek solution make it into the Greek parliament or not? My own hope would be that a party whose leader sells manuscripts claiming to be the letters of Jesus Christ simply can't make it into the Greek parliament. But, you know, when Golden Dawn first made it into the Greek parliament in May 2012, all the analysts in Greece, myself included, said this was just a kind of flash thing, they're not going to be re-elected, and of course they were, and they stabilised. So I'm not making any predictions about what might happen with Greek solution. But whatever happens with Greek solution, Golden Dawn, I think, is on the way out because the 4-year trial is slowly drawing to a close, and I think it's very likely that the leadership of Golden Dawn will actually be in jail. And if they do go to jail, I think this will be the end of Golden Dawn, not as a force on the Greek far right, but actually as a parliamentary party. Again, maybe that's a dangerous prediction, but I think this is likely to be the case. But this is my last slide. I just want to point out that Greek society remains deeply dissatisfied. Anybody who thinks that the crisis is over in Greece, that we're moving into a post-crisis phase, should just look at the Eurobarometer. If we look at these figures from the November 2018 Eurobarometer, we'll see there's massive lack of trust in political institutions, dissatisfaction with national democracy, strong feeling that things are going in the wrong direction in our country, and on all of these indicators, Greece actually has the highest dissatisfaction or distrust levels in the whole of the European Parliament. Therefore, whatever happens with Golden Dawn and with Greek solution, clearly there is strong possibilities for another far-right party to emerge, for some future mass mobilisation to lead to another far-right party. And I wouldn't say this in Greece because I don't want to give anybody ideas, but I think there is very definitely space for a serious political entrepreneur of the far right, somebody who can appear as a respectable politician to come in and benefit from all this dissatisfaction. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Susannah. Again, we have some minutes for questions and comments from the audience.
Nothing.
Take some time. Warm up.
I thought I'd convinced everybody that they didn't want to argue with me.
Well, the first, thank you. When I studied 5 years ago, more or less, this movement, I studied...
do you mean Golden Dawn?
What?
Which movement?
A Greek movement, this nationalist, or...
Okay.
I studied link with Ukrainian movement, Svoboda.
Okay.
Why? Because here in Valencia, these groups and their communities, Ukrainian and Greeks here in Valencia, are strong and are linked with these movements. My question is, what think link this movement, Greek movement, in English, Amanecer Dorado? Yeah. And Svoboda, the translation in Ukrainian language is liberty, or libertà.
Mm-hmm.
The question is, what is the link between these movements? Because the Greek movement here in Spain, for me, is a strange movement. It's no link with Italians, no link with England. What's the link between Ukrainian and Greek?
I have absolutely no idea. Perhaps you should answer that question. I really don't know. What is, of course, an important point that you made is that Golden Dawn has been very isolated in the European Parliament. If you may remember, after the last European Parliament election in 2014, Marine Le Pen could actually have had enough numbers to form a group if she had accepted Golden Dawn, which had 3 MEPs. She chose not to do that because she didn't want to be linked to this very not respectable paramilitary organisation of Golden Dawn. Golden Dawn has, I know that they have links with the with Nick Griffin, the British National Party. In fact, I believe, I haven't looked into it, but I believe that there were quite strong links between them. I think that they do probably have links with Ukraine and Russia, but I can't give you any information on that.
I know. Correct. Svoboda has two things. Is linked with Republic Party, American Republic, U.S. Republican Party. During the last 5 years, every year,
Okay.
He's died. John McCain, senator, U.S. senator, was supporting this movement, Ukrainian movement, Svoboda, with money and structure. And other fundament of this movement, Ukrainian movement, is Zionism.
Mm-hmm.
The Greek movement. What is the vision with Israel? This movement is Zionism? It's my question.
No, the Greek far right in general is anti-Semitic. It's quite a strong feature, actually, of Greek far right discourse. And just thinking about it, anti-Semitism is a common theme, in fact. And it's, I would say, it's quite a, it's something that finds resonance within Greek society to a considerable extent. Okay, sorry, I don't know more about those points. Not at all. Marco.
Yes, I have just one question. It's about Golden Dawn. I think it's quite strange, especially in Southern Europe, to find a far-right party linked, at least openly, support the fascist ideology and linked to fascism. So how to explain this? And if there are any new movements in the far right that, as you showed, the Golden Dawn seem now to almost disappear. At least it less support, it gets less support than it was before. And if there are some new movements that still appeal to these symbols and ideology.
Okay, I mean, perhaps a point I should have made is that unlike the other far-right parties before, which kind of emerged as breakaways from New Democracy, Golden Dawn was a party which had been around since 1983. It was actually, its official foundation as a party, its statute was submitted to the Supreme Court in 1983. So it is a long-term feature of Greek political life, but one that we didn't actually pay much attention to because it was a tiny little groupuscule. In the 2009 European Parliament election, which it contested, it won 0.3% of the vote. So I think the point about why we got this vote for Golden Dawn, we got this vote for Golden Dawn because people were really angry in May 2012, really angry. Votes went in all directions. 20% of the vote went to, 22% of the vote went to parties which didn't actually make it over the 3% threshold. Why did Golden Dawn pick up some of that vote? Golden Dawn was a known name. People knew Golden Dawn. We'd heard about it. It had been around. Golden Dawn also built very strongly on the anti-immigrant sentiment. Once New Democracy was legitimating the anti-immigrant discourse, people turned towards the real deal, which was Golden Dawn, who are actually going around beating up immigrants, not just saying they shouldn't be in the country. And So they were able to benefit from the general protest. And then what happened after the May 2012 election was that in the June 2012 election, which happened 6 weeks later, what we see with the vote generally was that people turned towards the parties which had actually made it across the 3% threshold to enter Parliament. Because Golden Dawn had done that, it therefore survived. It became one of the key representatives of the far right. So I think that's why Golden Dawn emerged. I think we also have to bear in mind the climate that I mentioned before, this climate of continual attacks in particularly the German press on Greece, you know, you lying, stealing, thieving Greeks who don't do any work, etc., etc., etc. And this sparked a very strong reaction in Greece, strong reminiscences of the Second World War, strong anti-German sentiments, really a kind of really strong nationalist backlash. And I think that is something which we don't see in the other crisis-hit countries. There isn't this kind of discourse which was a real insult to national dignity in the case of other countries which had bailouts. You know, nobody said that the Irish were cheating, thieving, lying. They should sell, I'm not sure what their national equivalent to the Parthenon is, but, you know, that didn't happen. It was very dangerous, actually, what was happening during the early years of the crisis. That discourse that was emanating, particularly from Germany, in order to validate the treatment of Greece during the crisis. But it's actually been very, very, I think, very damaging.
And particularly important because of the Greek nationalism previous to that situation. Okay? No, it was just a comment.
Yeah.
So, any other questions, comments? Okay, so we jump in to the last. Thank you very much. Of course, Susannah, and we jump to the last presentation. So now, finally, we are having
Bé, finalment
the
ara
exceptional case.
tenim el cas excepcional.
We used to share exceptionalism,
Estem
but it seems that now Portugal
acostumats
is the
i
only case.
pareix que
So we have
Portugal és
Marco
l'únic
Lisi from
cas.
Nova
Tenim
University in
Marco
Lisbon,
Lisi de la Nova Universitat de
who is going
Lisboa,
to talk about
que ens va parlar sobre
the failure of the radical
el
right in
fracàs de la
Portugal,
dreta radical
and still with
a
question mark,
Portugal.
is that the last exception?
I, bueno, és la gran excepció.
Okay.
So, whenever you have the floor.
So good morning. I would like also to thank the organizers for this wonderful workshop. And I will start my presentation with a brief overview of the political landscape in Portugal, for those who are not familiar with. And then I will analyze the far right in terms of electoral performance, party organization strategy, and then the recent elections and the future prospects. Now, my starting point is this picture, which compares the 2009 elections, legislative ones, and the 2019 European elections. Those I know that are not really comparable, but I think the two graphs are quite telling in terms of the overall stability of the party systems. As you can see, these two, I don't know if this works. So these two bigger proportion of the graphs are the two mainstream parties, the Socialist Party and the Social Democratic Party. And then there are 3 or 4 smaller parties. There has been some shifts between these minor parties, but as you can see, the players are the same. In 2009, there is one new party, the People, Animals and Nature Party, which is a small environmentalist party. But I mean, the picture is quite the same. Needless to say that this was not the last decade, it was not a quiet period. As you know, Portugal experienced a bailout, a huge political, economic, and social crisis. And so what makes the Portuguese case interesting is indeed the fact that despite these all changes, there has not been until now big changes in the political system. Here you can see also the overall stability of the Portuguese party system. There are two indicators of this stability. One is electoral volatility. As you can see, the volatility has remained quite low, also especially comparing to other Southern European countries. Lower than previous elections, for example, in the 80s. And also in terms of party system fragmentation, it is quite low, with a small increase because of the emergence of this new party, the PAN, People, Animal and Nature. But overall, there is a lot of continuity in the party system. However, as I said, there is a lot of favorable factors that, if we look at the literature on the emergence and success of radical right parties, can also be applied to the Portuguese case, especially during the crisis period. And in fact, as you know, there has been an economic crisis, a huge economic crisis with rising levels of unemployment, a significant fall in GDP, and so on. Also, high levels of corruption. If we look at different indicators, for example, Transparency International, Portugal, as other Southern European countries, always rank in the first positions. As you know, one of the recent prime ministers, socialist prime minister, was also involved in a scandal. So this, of course, it was a negative consequence for the image of the political elite. So this can be seen also in terms of decreasing level of institutional trust and other indicators in terms of the feelings towards the main institution and political parties. Growing Euroscepticism, especially during the crisis period, although the majority of Portuguese people still have positive feelings towards the EU, but as I will show, during the crisis, there has been more negative evaluations. There is also what we can call a catalyzation of the mainstream parties, because the Socialist Party and the Social Democratic parties have very often converged towards the same policies, especially in terms of socioeconomic policies. Personalization of politics is another feature that is supposed to trigger political change and foster political instability. And we know that political parties in Portugal are also very dependent on the figures of their leaders. The role of television is also another facilitating factor that can promote political party system change, and last but not least, weak partisan loyalties. I will be very quick on some indicators on the period as the country has gone through the crisis period, as you can see, for example, in these tables. And this is a trend that we can also apply to other public opinion indicators. So we have a fall during the crisis in terms of GDP and an increase in unemployment. And then in the recent period, as you may know, the country seems to recover quite well from the bailout. And so there are some positive results, both in terms of economics and in terms of public opinion indicators. There is also, of course, the worsening of inequalities, especially during the crisis period. Portugal, among European countries, is one of the most unequal society. These are public opinion indicators. As I said, during the crisis, there has been a drop in the positive evaluation of institutions and the main players, for example, parties, the government, and so on. But then, during the last 2 or 3 years, there has been a positive trend. And this is also can be seen in terms of Euroscepticism. It is quite remarkable to see that, for example, in terms of people that favor the economic and monetary union, Portugal was one of the, even compared to Southern European countries, during the crisis period, the support of the economic and monetary union was lower than other Southern European countries. And usually we know that Portuguese are quite favorable to the process of European integration. Now, one issue that is often discussed in the literature as an important factor for the emergent success of radical right party is the emergence of new cleavages. And here, is, as you can see, basically the main cleavages have also remained the same. The main cleavage is the socioeconomic one, which can be seen here, and I will show you later more the position of the main parties on this cleavage. And there are other cleavages which are quite important, like, for example, the religious cleavage in terms of Euroscepticism also, because we have the radical left, which is strongly against the European Union. But the feature, which I think is quite peculiar to other European countries, is that they overlap. So we can put the parties on the same dimension, the main dimension of competition in the socioeconomic ones, and the other cleavages, they overlap with these main dimensions. In the 90s, the libertarian authoritarian dimension was politicized by the left bloc, the emergence of a new party, especially because of the politicization of post-materialist values, but it was not linked to the immigration. So immigration was not a new cleavage, contrary to other European countries. And you can see, for example, here, the position of the main parties. So you can put the same from left to the right, the same parties along the main dimensions of competition in terms of socioeconomic, in terms of religious cleavage, in terms of pro or anti-Europe, and so on. On the other hand, the attitudes towards immigration was not only quite positive in terms of, of course, across Europe, these are data from the European Social Survey. There are not big differences across countries, so this is not a good explanatory factor for the emergence of the new right, because, for example, if you look Sweden, Sweden has a very strong anti-immigration parties, strong extreme right parties, but they are quite favorable in terms of public opinion to immigration. They have figures very similar to other countries like Germany or Portugal. And on the other hand, this does not mean, even if there is a more positive evaluation, especially, for example, comparing to Greece or Italy, in other Southern European countries, this does not mean, because these are averages, but if we look at the data, we know that at the individual level, there are 20%, more or less, 25% that they still have negative opinions about immigration. Here there is one indicator, one question, but if we look at other questions, the results are very similar. So this does not mean that, the thing is that there is a demand that can be explored by extreme right parties, but this is not being politicized, or at least the forces that have been trying to politicize this dimension have not been successful, and I will explain why in a minute. Okay? So if we look at the extreme right in Portugal, here again we have to distinguish two different approaches. One that we can call the old extreme right, and a more recent one which belongs to the new extreme right party family. The first one is the old one. Here there are other smaller parties, minor parties, especially in the 70s and the 80s. This is the most famous one, but it's not a successful party. It was the Christian Democratic Party. That was all the right, let's say, linked to the authoritarian regime. So they supported the politicians, the political elite, was part of the new state regime and supported the old authoritarian regime, and was very unsuccessful. It disappeared at the beginning of the 80s. The main, the most visible politicians were co-opted by mainstream parties, and the party disappeared. At the end of the 80s and 90s, it appears a new party, which is still present in the political landscape, which is the National Renovator Party. And this is a new extreme right party because he accepts democratic institutions, and although he has some ambiguous feelings towards the authoritarian regime, but clearly it tries to import some of the main issues that are characterizing the new extreme right parties in Europe. Okay, so this party was born in the 90s because he actually penetrates a previous old party, the PRD, which was a party formed by an ex-president of the Republic in the 80s, but then the parties lacked the resources, lacked politicians, and so this party, the extreme right politicians, bought the label and the party and changed the name into the Partido Nacional Renovador, the Renovator National Party. There were at the beginning conflicts between an old right pro-authoritarian regime and the new ethnic nationalist extremism, and that was the last one was the factions that won and imposed a new agenda within the party. It still has some, as I said before, some mixed feelings towards the Salazar's regime, but at the same time accept democratic institutions. That means that at least formally you could not find documents in the party that they support openly the authoritarian regime, but sometimes the politicians say that we should reassess, we should accept to understand the authoritarian regime. They also are against the process of European integration, not mainly because of, in terms of socioeconomic policies, but in terms of the cultural dimensions. So they say that Portugal, as other European countries, is experiencing an invasion from immigrants and from those people who do not share common tradition and common European values, and so we should reject and they support nationalist and sovereignist policies. Also, they are clearly against immigrants, and this is a complex question. I will explore more in detail in a minute, but clearly it tried to politicize this question, although there is not, as I said, Portugal, in terms of refugees, it didn't not experience a crisis like other European countries, but they see this problem as, especially for those immigrants coming from the Lusophone countries, the ex-colonies, and that they are reproducing more than, let's say, the white people, the Portuguese living there. They see there is the threat for the future generations to be replaced by those descendants from the people coming from the ex-colonies. So that's the frame that they use to politicize the immigration question. And they have also, of course, strong authoritarian and conservative values, especially in terms of law and order issues. Okay? here is a picture that we used to place the political parties based on a voting advice application. That was the first voting advice application that we did in Portugal. It was for the 2009 elections, and as you can see, the PNR it's clearly at the close to the pole of the traditional nationalist side, but it's more or less in the center in terms of the socioeconomic dimension, because in fact it supported welfare policies, for example, in support of the families, in support for the pensioners, reformers, public intervention also of the state into the economy, for example, in terms of wealth and education and so on. So he tried to occupy a new position against, let's say, more liberal position of the traditional right, but clearly more close to the traditional and nationalist pole. If you want more details about this, I can explain how basically we had 30 items in terms of socioeconomic and also traditional policies, cultural policies, and we place each parties in these two axes according to their policy platforms and manifesto. This is the electoral performance of this party. I mean, this is the more successful extreme right party, okay? So, as you can see, the first things to notice is that he hasn't achieved more than 0.5%. So below 1% of the vote. So it's a very minor party, okay? Although, despite this low score, we can see that there has been an increase in the electoral performance in the legislative elections. So if you look at the total number of votes, in 2009, the party obtained more or less 10,000 votes, and in 2015, it's almost more than doubled. So it's 27,000 of votes, which is quite significant for a very small and minor party, this increase. We will have next legislative elections in 2019, so we can see if the performance, if this trend will hold also for the next legislative elections. On the other hand, as you can see, the European elections, what we usually call second-order elections, were not very, it wasn't an arena favorable to this new party, or at least that the party was able to explore, to get more visibility and to penetrate also in the institutional arena, because as you can see, in terms of the percentage of the votes and the total number of the votes, it remains quite low. Even if the last elections, it was more or less in the same proportion of the previous one, the 2014 elections. Okay? What is interesting is to look at the territorial penetration of the party. And these graphs show you the local, the performance of the PNR in terms of electoral performance at the local level, at the local elections, okay? As you can see, so the blue line, the blue bar is the national score, and the yellow one, the orange one, is in Lisbon, in the capital, in the main district of the city. As you can see, in the local elections, the party almost gets votes in Lisbon. So it's particularly, basically is virtually, he has no presence in the territory. So it just gets support in the main urban area, in the capital. Of course, in the 2017, there has been an attempt, because he had more resources, to build some structure, but especially in Oporto, so the second biggest city, it lacks a territorial penetration in the province. And this is about the strategy of the PNR. the PNR is also seen as the first attempt to introduce in Portugal a populist discourse. This was a very controversial billboard that was used in the 2005 legislative elections. And that billboard was met with mockery and even not only in the media, but also from the mainstream politicians. It was not very successful because, first of all, immigration is not regarded as a big problem in Portugal. The main problems in terms of public opinion are always unemployment, socioeconomic issues, not cultural issues. So it was quite unsuccessful. Then there was also the attempt to link the party to the more successful international partners like the National Front, which has always been a source of inspiration for this party that was used in 2007 or 12, I don't remember, but supporting the nationalism as trying to, let's say, legitimate the policies in terms of its ideology. And that is another outdoor based on law and order issues against crimes and against corruption also is another popular common dimensions that is used to campaign. Now, in 2009, the recent 2019 European elections, we have new players on the right side of the political spectrum. The first one, it was what is called Alliance, that was founded in last year by an ex-president of the Social Democratic Party, the mainstream center-right party, which is Pedro Santana Lopes, was also a former prime minister. And he tried to appeal to moderate right-wing voters. It's clearly pro-European, but although not so pro-European as, for example, the Socialist Party or even the Social Democratic Party. So it tried to put, let's say, more criticism on the European discourse. But I will focus more on the other one, which is another new player that's clearly on the extreme right side of the political spectrum, which is called Lega, that's enough, or it's called also Basta, that's the same, more or less. Lega is the coalition that they build with other extreme right party. Basta is the name of the new party, which was founded by an ex, also it was a previous PSD leader, it's called Andrea Ventura, who is a famous political commentator, TV commentator, especially on football. So it's very popular in Portugal. And it was also the first party to openly define itself as an extreme right populist party. So while the other extreme right parties, even the PNR, always rejected the denomination of populist party because it's always had some negative connotations. This party clearly adopted let's say, unpolitically correct discourse against the political elite, against the politicians. So as I will show you, there are strong elements of populism within this, adopted by this party. Contrary to other extreme right parties, they refuse to adopt a strong anti-European positions. So it was not a primary dimensions of competition because, as I said, the main issues that they tried to politicize were based on the reform of the political system. However, it is interesting to see that it was quite the position on Europe was quite ambiguous. Okay? So this is again another voting advice application that was the last one that it was made for the recent European elections, and you can see that this is where the new party Basta can be put, which is on the far right, more to the far right, especially in terms of socioeconomic dimension. That was the PNR, and also quite conservative and anti-European. Another feature, but this is, as I said, a peculiarity of the Portuguese party system. As you can see, the main parties can be put in the diagonal. So as you move to the right, you also come down in terms of the conservative and libertarian axis. And that is the same that we saw in the 2009 elections, okay? So in terms of programmatic stance, as I said, the first priority was to reform the political system, for example, to reduce the number of MPs, law and order issues, for example, to introduce life imprisonment, chemical castration, and so on, reform of the judicial system, neoliberal stances on economic matters. As you can see, it differs from the other extreme right party, the PNR, especially in terms of socioeconomic dimensions, defense of traditional conservative values, for example, against same-sex marriage, etc., and against corruption. Okay? These are just two, again, billboards that have been used during the last campaign. That was against it was for the reduction of the number of MPs, and the other one it was against this question. It's not openly against immigrants, but against gypsies, because the gypsies are regarded from this party as one of the main threats for the Portuguese. So the gypsies are receiving subsidies from the state, and they do not work, and they should be changed the situation. So, in terms of results, for the 2019 European elections, it is, of course, as I said, there has not been big changes, but one of the main interesting feature was the fragmentation of the right. As I said, there were at least 3 or 4 new parties on the right of the political spectrum. So that would be, for example, some commentators were thinking that the PNR would disappear because of these new, the emergence of the new parties. But in fact, as you can see, this is the coalition Lega, that's NAF, the new party, the new extreme right party. It was quite successful because in the first elections, remember that the party was founded just 2 months before the elections. Okay, so it basically it starts from nothing. So 2 months just to put up all the campaign materials, the outdoors, the candidates, and so on. It's nothing in terms of campaigns, and he was able to get 50,000 of votes, much more, the double that the PNR. It was the best score ever achieved in the 2015 elections. So the politicians, they were very happy about these results. And they say that they would make even a better results in the next legislative elections. And as you can see, with this, it's not, I mean, that's different because we cannot really compare European elections, especially as you can see, Portugal was the fifth countries in Europe where the turnout was lower. So it was a very 70% of abstentions. It's a lot. Okay, so it's not comparable to the legislative elections, but with this proportion of the votes, and if these votes are concentrated in the main cities, Lisbon or Porto, it can elect 1 MP. Okay, so it's not. And another interesting result is that the PNR has not disappeared. So the PNR has a different electorate from the that's enough, the Basta, Lega. So they really don't compete for the same voters. Okay? So the PNR got more or less the same results that it got in the previous European elections. It remained the same. Okay? So where did they come from, the votes that the people they vote from this new party? Here you can see the electoral performance for the districts in the all countries for the new party, the extreme right party. Okay? And here you can see the difference between the PNR and this new party, the Basta, that's enough. The main parties where it gets vote, the main districts where it gets better results, so above 2%, except Lisbon, where red districts. It seems quite strange, but in the Alentejo, Évora, Santarém, Beja, Setúbal, there are red districts that is where usually left-wing parties do very well, like the Communist Party or the Left Bloc or the Socialist Party. I don't think that left-wing voters voted for this party. I think that probably we don't have we don't have good studies to see at the micro level what is the profile of the voters of this new party. But my feeling is that they were able to mobilize new voters for the first time, probably young voters, the young generations, that didn't like what we call geringonça, the contraption, that is the agreement between the Socialist Party and the radical left parties, and they were more, let's say, sensitive to this new discourse, anti-elite and anti-system discourse, and probably they voted for this new party. But that's my feeling. As I said, I could not prove this interpretation. So how to explain until now? As I said, we can say that the extreme right was unsuccessful in terms, especially when, from a comparative point of view, comparing to other South European countries. How can we explain the failure of the far right parties in terms of, especially in terms of electoral representation and performance? First of all, as I said, there have been no new cleavages. So as I said, the main dimensions of competitions have remained the same. There was not new issues to politicize, or at least they failed to politicize new issues. And the salience of anti-immigration issue also was very low in terms of public opinion and also in terms of the main political parties. Then there are other political factors that I think they are quite relevant and important. First of all, the polarization of the party system. You can see the parties display a wide range of policy positions from the extreme left to the extreme right. Actually, usually the mainstream right has been able to cover very well, for example, law and order issues or other policies that can be explored more by more extreme far-right parties. Then there is also an important thing that, in my opinion, is very peculiar to the Portuguese case, that is the nationalist discourse adopted by the Communist Party. So the Communist Party has a very sovereignist discourse, approach, both in terms of especially in terms of socioeconomic policies, and that, of course, appeal to some, especially the lower strata of the society that support this party. The lack of charismatic leadership also it's a very important feature. Until now, there's not been a successful political entrepreneur that was able to politicize and appeal and have a good visibility in terms of public opinion. The lack of territorial branches, that was at least a feature that explained the poor performance of the PNR. Now we will see if things will change, especially for the adoption of new information and communication technologies and social networks. This may not be any more relevant factor, but we will see. And then there are, of course, institutional constraints and ideological legacy. As you know, electoral laws in terms of party funding, media cover, electoral system, they usually been regarded as an important factor, but in my opinion, they're not very relevant for explaining the peculiarity of the Portuguese case, because new parties have been able to emerge and elect MPs, as the panel, People, Animal, and Nature shows. Especially if they concentrate their votes in the main districts, the legal barriers to get representation, they are not so, they're not impossible. Then there is a constitutionalization of political parties. Of course, this is an important asset, especially for mainstream parties. The legacy of the totalitarian regime, although here again, I don't think this argument holds anymore, because there are more and more young people who do not have any direct link or memory of the past, of the totalitarian regime. So they are more, let's say, free to vote for a new party that has a more critical view on the liberal democracies European style. And then there is a social stigma, which is, I think, an important characteristic, because these parties are still regarded, especially in the public opinion and the media, as extremist and anti-democratic parties. So there is let's say, a reputational shield that they have to overcome if they want to be legitimized and to want to succeed in the electoral arena. The future of the extreme right important. Just to conclude this this is the last slide. So as I can show you, there are some favorable factors in terms of public opinion, for example, attitudes, and also at the political level. The use of social networks may provide a new instrument to mobilize new voters for the extreme right. The high level of abstention is also provide an important arena to get more support, and we know that this is especially when there are many people that are dissatisfied with the status quo and the political system. And a failure of traditional right-wing parties can also be important to improve the electoral performance and the chances of the new right parties. Okay? Then there is the capacity of coalition building, with, as I can see, the landscape now is very fragmented, but if they are able to build a new, more cohesive force in terms of the extreme right, they can make a breakthrough also in the political system. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this wonderful picture of the Portuguese exceptional case and the reasons why it's so. So we have just a few minutes before going for lunch to have some questions. Manuela?
There are no others.
I don't see any other right now, but maybe later. So go ahead, please.
You want to go for lunch?
No. This one.
Okay, I try to be quick. No, as you said, it is an exceptional case. And I'm struggling. So I have a comment and a question. I start with a question. Portugal is an exceptional case for what concerns the radical right, but it is also an exceptional case for what concerns left-wing populism. So in Southern Europe, left-wing populist parties emerged since 2008, some of them extremely successful, not in Portugal. And so my first question is for you. Would you use, or which factors among those that you have mentioned to us for what concerns the radical right, would you use to explain or to try to understand also this non-emergence or no consolidation of the populist left? Of course, the first factor I usually think about is intra-party competition. So the bloc left able to occupy a space. But I would like to. The other one is. I like it a lot, the list of the factors that you mentioned for the radical right failure so far. And in my view, two things. When I was listening to you, the stigmatization element, I think also it's very important. And if you look at the banners, the flyers they used in this new part, the That's Enough. Also in terms of visual analysis, if you do that, they differ a lot. They are much more appealing, these flyers, than the previous flyers of the other radical right parties. I wouldn't vote, for them. They are really ugly radical right guys. You can approach, also in terms of color, it is more appealing. And as you said, in my view, the mix between the populist appeal and the radical right traditional core values appeal can be, in my view, the key for the success. For instance, we saw similar, Alternative für Deutschland has not been so successful now, but in Germany, I saw the same trend. The NPD was stigmatized. Then Alternative für Deutschland, that combined racism, nativism, and so on, with a anti-casta, the anti-elite appeal, was able to emerge because it was able to be conceived as a legitimate player, so exit from this stigma. So I think that this 1%, I don't know what is your opinion, but in my view, this mix between populist, anti-elitist, populist appeal, plus the usual stuff of the radical right could be a winning solution, a winning formula. But I would like to know your opinion. What is among these factors the most important one, you think?
Well, starting from the second question, which is easier than the first one. Actually, I think the new party, if we look at the votes that they obtain and the fact that the party was recognized by the Constitutional Court just 1 month before the election. So it has very few resources. They were very happy about the result. Even if they cannot expect to elect any member of European Parliament, but actually they did much better than other traditional extreme right party did ever before. So it was quite remarkable, the result. And I think that, of course, as I said, the leadership is important because the other guy, the leader of the PNR is very bad. In terms of visibility, message, communication skills, and so on. So that's a different kind of language, approach, and communication style. And also, he was very smart in the use of new social network and new technologies because they have very few resources. They understood that, especially for young voters, what I show you, there are traditional tools of political campaigns. Billboards are very common in Portugal, but they are old ones. So now political campaigns, even more and more, are through the new technologies, smartphones and the internet and so on. And they were very active and very smart in the use of Facebook, WhatsApp, and other new technologies. So I could not show any results from, to link successful campaign with the use of these, but I think it was an important component of their campaign. And that was also a mean to neutralize the stigmatization from the traditional media outlets. That because usually these parties, they are not regarded as legitimate actors to talk about in the media newspapers, the traditional media newspapers, in the television. So although of course this guy has been able to get more visibility because of the sports debates. in which he participated, but not in the political debates. So that was another difference between. And but in the traditional media outlets, these parties are still regarded as anti-democratic. They don't want to talk about them, so they have to find the other channels of. And that it seems, I think, they have tried to explore, I think, a right way to overcome these constraints. Regardless, with regard to the first question, the populist left, that's a complex question. Of course, the Communist Party had a more populist approach, because not only because of the anti-elitist discourse, which was always part of, I mean, it was until 2015, it was regarded as an anti-system party. So they put always together the Socialist Party and the other parties. They are all the same. They are the old elites. No matter who governs, they are doing always the same thing. So that's a typical populist discourse. And we defend the people, the poor, the workers. So we are the real, who represent the real, let's say, the losers of the society, or those who are not represented anymore by these the mainstream parties. So the Communist Party has always been one of, at least has been regarded as one of the factors that explain why no successful populist extreme right parties have gained more votes. Because for those who are not, I mean, satisfied with the political system, there was this protest party, and so they could vote for the Communist Party. The left bloc is different because he tried to appeal to mobilize protest voters, but it was not very successful. So we could see that in 2011, that was the bailout elections. The left bloc also tried to appeal and to adopt a more populist discourse, but was unsuccessful. Perhaps because of the competition with the Communist Party, or because it was not very, the leadership was not very committed, very credible in terms of populist appeals. But the fact is that after that, he didn't campaign through a populist discourse. And that's, I think it's a strategic choice, because they want to be part now of the mainstream political system. The fact that now are in coalition, I mean, they support the socialist minority government will make the party more, let's say, part of the traditional system, more institutionalized.
Another question?
Can you hear me? Yeah. So thanks for the talk, first of all. So I have a remark regarding the mainstream media stigmatization towards the far-right parties and its impact on them, right? Because I feel like, well, maybe because of my age, but I feel like there is a new movement of counterculture against mainstream media, and I feel like when mainstream media criticizes those parties, some people, just because of the sake of it, just because of they are part of this counterculture movement, and you see that when you join many Facebook meme groups, for example, you see many people supporting those parties just because it goes against the mainstream media. And it is actually like the new revolutionary thing to do, and the new edgy and cool thing to do. So I feel like many people actually vote for those parties just because they're at least, I don't know, in Portugal so much, but at least in Spain, I see many people supporting Vox, for example, just because it goes against what people say. Well, you should not do, right? Some people say, oh, Vox is a far-right party, and we don't want this in our society. So some people are like, well, if that's what the mainstream media says, or that's what the main opinion is, I'm going to do completely the opposite to that, just because of this counterculture movement. So I don't know how much of a factor that is, and I feel like sometimes social media stigmatization can backfire towards the mainstream media, because sometimes it actually empowers those parties. And well, that was just my remark.
Well, I think that more than let's say counter effects, the effects is in terms of demobilization. So I think that the fact that traditional media outlets talk in specific, according to a specific traditional discourse or not, the stigmatization of these other parties, I think it helps people to think that they don't want to care about politics, that politics is not worthwhile, and so I think another effect is to let's say to make people, especially younger people, more involved in politics, and it should be keep also in mind that the main source of political information in Portugal is not traditional newspapers, but it's television. So that's the main, in terms of, for young people, it's not television, it's internet, by smartphone or other tablets or other tools. And they look especially at the social networks and what their fellows and other people's friends look at. So they have different channels of getting and receiving information. But for most people, the mainstream, the most important tool is the television. And in the television, I mean, if you don't, if you don't appear in the television, I think it's always better, regardless of if it is in the positive or negative way. It's always worse than if you don't, if you don't appear in the television. And these people usually are not invited in many political debates or programs. So people, they don't know who they are. And if you don't know who they are, it's very difficult to vote for them, because they want to vote for people who know who they are. Now, this guy is different because it's a very well-known politician. So, as I said, it's different from the previous ones. As the other leader, although he is, in terms of political strategy, incompetent, of course, that is an important part of the explanation why this party failed to improve their performance. But he was not he has not a strong visibility in the people. So that's
okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Marco, again, for your presentation and the Q&As. I want to finish this session right now here, thanking again the four of the paper givers, of the presenters. It was a strong effort for all of them to come here, take planes, getting up very early, and so on, and now returning to their usual business. But thanks to you all. They were very good presentations, and we are delighted to have you here. Just remember, this afternoon we will resume business at 4 o'clock with the following sessions, okay? So you will be more than welcome here. Thank you.